Hi, good morning everybody. This is Chris Harvey, Operations Director at IMS CAD. Want to wish everyone a good morning. Really briefly, some quick housekeeping for you. You'll see on your panel down at the bottom right hand side the questions box. If you have anything you wish to ask me during the presentation, post your questions. I'll try and answer those as we go along. What I would say is we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end if there is any. Welcome today though. Today is one of our brief half-hour webinars. Today we're talking about reducing the cost of IT with virtualization. And really briefly what we're going to do today, I'm just going to give you a quick introduction. We're going to talk about the demands that new CAD systems and requirements for collaboration, adoption of BIM have been placing on IT. We're going to talk about how IT responds to those demands in terms of what's necessary to meet the needs of these users in a workstation deployment traditionally. We're then going to look and give an overview of a virtualized environment, a cloud environment, and what we can achieve there, and really look at where the cost savings are associated with that so that we can see how virtualization is a perfect platform for the new CAD users and for the developments we're seeing in CAD, and certainly for the adoption of BIM and the requirements that that has. So that's really simply what we're going to run over today, fairly quick, fairly brief, so I'll crack straight into things. As I say, any questions, pop them in the box and I can deal with those as we go along. Failing that, we'll have a brief Q&A at the end, or of course I'll give you all my details to take any other queries you have offline. So straight from there we'll move forward into our first slide today. So the demands now placed on IT. So let's consider really what I want everyone to think about here is the increased demands we're now seeing being placed on IT, developments we've seen in CAD software, the requirement, certainly if we look at movements from AutoCAD and 2D development work and design work to 3D work, where we're needing much faster processors in the workstations, much bigger GPUs to process the graphical data, etc., etc. So let's just briefly talk about this. I'm going to mention, first off, we're going to talk about data. What I want everybody just get an understanding of this. We were doing some testing last week for a client of ours based out of Germany, and we were basically loading up a fairly straightforward Revit file, a single Revit file at 18 meg. When we actually looked at all of the linked files and had to load all of the linked files for that 18 meg single file, we were actually loading 1.2 gig of data. So what we're talking about here, one of the key demands that we've got to understand is the real significance of the amount of data that we're now being required to process. So this is obviously a big consideration. The file sizes, as we get more and more collaborators working on these BIM-based models, multidisciplines all coming in, putting in their information, the amount of actual data that's required is getting significantly bigger. So we've got bigger processing demands. Now these are done obviously workstation or indeed at server, but if we're talking about bigger processing, we're talking about reprocessing, so that we can look at changes made in one of those disciplines, in one of those areas, and look and measure the impact that that's going to have on the others. So we've got a hardware impact here, higher grade workstations, faster CPUs, more cores, added RAM, bigger GPUs, and all of that nature. So if we move on, let's look at the second issue, the second demands placed on IT, which is access. How to make access available, access to all that data for all of the third-party users and the mix of users we now need. If you look through a project life cycle, that mix of users will change significantly at different stages of the project. Certainly if we look, different not just users but user groups. Certainly as we move from the design phases through the building and construction, and indeed the ultimate management further on in the project. So huge changes in the users, all requiring different data, all requiring access, but not just to the data, also access to the applications. So for IT, it's about managing not just the data, be that the requirement for additional disk space locally and equally centrally at the file shares, but also the applications and the management of those distributed apps, which are now getting distributed further and further among a higher number of users. So the key for IT here is not just access to the data, but also the apps and managing to get the right apps and data to the right user when they need it, and removing access rights when they don't need it. So that's quite a big pressure and a big strain put on IT through that. My last point I'm going to make here is about security, and I think this needs to be mentioned because for IT this is a huge issue, and as we see the number of collaborators needing access to do their work, we have huge amounts of data moving around, and this data, the files that are moving across the network, put a pressure on the network, certainly, so we've got network issues that IT has to face, but more importantly on the security side is as soon as this data leaves the confines of the controlled environment that IT control and moves on to third parties' hardware on third-party devices, then basically IT loses its ability to control and keep that data secure. So this is now outside their control, much harder for them to secure. They can put management processes in place and various things to try and secure that data, but ultimately it's a big headache and a big strain placed on IT by that. So let's have a little look at how IT potentially has responded to these demands and what's the impact on IT in dealing with all this. Well, if we're going to look at this, we're going to look at this initially in the traditional workstation deployment, because that's pretty much where we are, and then I'll give you some comparisons about how we are in a virtualized environment. So first off the bat, let's talk about that data. Well, the requirement for IT here, how do they respond to this need, these bigger files, all this more data that they've got to process and reprocess? Well, ultimately it's upgrading workstations, higher performance processors to handle the increased processing, higher standard of RAM, of GPUs, all of this basically increasing capital expenditure to get the level of performance at the endpoint devices. There may also, of course, with this data come an increase in storage centrally, file shares, indeed an increase in storage locally at the workstations. So that's not, that's really going to increase their total cost of storage in terms of keeping all this data and then providing all this data around. The next point I'm going to bring up is the access. Well, to give this data and move these large files, obviously we've got to make those available across the network. So we're going to see some significant changes here and impacts on IT. So first off, let's talk about file sharing programs, data management tools. How does IT control that data that's moving around the network? The control of versions. Perhaps they've got to improve, upgrade the networks, cope with the extra traffic. We might then be talking about WAN optimization tools, different devices needing to improve the network performance. Might have to upgrade the networks altogether and put in MPLS networks, or add bandwidth, pipe sizes to different branches or locations. So all in all, we can see it's an increase in cost facing IT in terms of moving this data around. So we're just talking about the data here. Let's then talk about the applications. One of the key things we're seeing today, one of the key buzzwords is, of course, collaboration. Everyone's all talking about collaboration in all of their aspects of their work. Well, collaboration should be about working together. If all that IT is doing is pushing their potential problems onto their partners, that doesn't really fall into the remit of collaboration. Now, I'll give you an idea. We have current projects running with deployments that we've done where we have a requirement for one architectural engineering firm to load basically Revit from 2010, 11, 12, 13 and 14 because they still have current projects running on all those versions. So is it reasonable to accept in a collaborating environment that the third-party contractors should also be able to supply the applications for the correct years to work on those projects? Well, it's very unlikely, and it doesn't really fit into the means and the method of collaboration. So it's necessary for IT again to control this, not just for their own users, but for their collaborating users for these projects that still run live. So again, this all needs to be managed, and there's a cost involved in obviously supplying this and managing this, getting the right applications to the right users with the right data. Huge pressure on IT. Increased management, increased costs is ultimately what that all leads to. So how do we deal with the security issue? Well, IT now has to manage all of this distributed data. It's often data on hardware controlled by third parties, completely out of their control. They put management systems in place. These obviously come at a cost. Ultimately, the one thing that is for sure, they can't fully control the data or its security once it's left their control and once it falls to a third party. So unfortunately, this will always be, and is one of the key dangers of collaboration in a distributed workstation deployment. Ultimately, what we can see is IT can respond to those issues, respond to those demands, that the increased requirements put on it as we see CAD systems develop and the adoption of BIM and the like. But ultimately, all of those things that IT does leads to increased cost and, of course, increased management, which has a cost itself. So where are we with a virtualized environment? Let's look at the standard sort of virtualized deployment and look at the characteristics of that deployment. What is it we traditionally see in a virtual deployment? Well, the first thing we see, centralized. We've centralized everything. Now, what this means is we're centralizing resource. Let's talk about hardware resource. We take this away from the distributed model where the processing is done at the workstation, and we bring this all into central servers where it can be done more efficiently, and from there it's obviously centralized, virtualized, and then delivered to users as an on-demand service. So what in effect this means is that the workstations work at a level of efficiency. I think the highest figures I've seen are approximately 30% efficiency. The other 70% is sort of held in reserve for those extreme moments that the user needs to do some ray tracing or rendering, whatever heavy three-duty work they're going to do. And the workstation is geared up for that. What we see in a server-based solution, in a virtualized solution or cloud solution, is we're seeing all of that resource centralized and virtualized and available for a user on demand. So they can take their percentage of that resource as and when they need it. It's there for them, but it's not sitting idle when they're not using it. It's being used for the other users. So I think a good way of looking at this, if you look of measuring this really, if you look at a situation where potentially we're looking at a Revit deployment, building design suite, let's take, we would traditionally, I think, see in the workstations normally 1 to 2 gig of GPU. Now, I would normally say 2 gig, but I was speaking to somebody this week who's actually deployed Revit with 1 gig at GPU, not too effectively, but they have done it. So if we talk about 2 gig of GPU at workstation per user, for a 20 user, we're talking about 40 gig of GPU. So that's the investment we're talking about from IT making in the hardware just at GPU. If we put those 20 users onto central servers and virtualized that deployment, we would put at maximum 8 gig of GPU to service those 20 users. So I think you can see immediately where hardware resource can be used more efficiently in a centralized and virtualized environment. So as I say, that's all then used as an on-demand delivery to them. The endpoint device doesn't do the processing. It becomes of little consequence. So therefore, we can look at potential savings at the endpoint device, these being device and operating system independent. So that's one of the key things we can look at straight away from the centralization of the resources and where we can see a cost saving there. We're also then looking at a situation where we're securing what we've done. The data never leaves those central servers. The data is never going out across the network. So we don't have the issue now of having to control the data, of upgrading the network or anything else. This is all held centrally. So the users accessing this come in, view this data. The data never leaves. The data never goes to the endpoint device. So all of these control issues that need to be put on that data have gone. They all basically are moved, taken away completely as all the data stays central in a secured environment. So we're removing the requirement to increase the network capacity to move these large files because they're not going backwards and forwards. All we see moving across is the pixel changes, mouse movements and keystrokes. Again, those endpoint devices no longer handle the data. All they're doing is accessing the central server. So at the endpoint devices, we can see a huge reduction in cost there. We no longer need the expensive heavy-duty workstations, high-powered workstations. These fit into any device, so we can really look at low-cost thin clients to replace the workstations as we move forward. And equally, the bring your own device policies, we can fit into any device of the users wanting to access that system. Mobility is the point we've made here, which again, not just in terms of the users, any device, anywhere, any OS, but we're also talking about mobility for the enterprise, the ability for the enterprise to upscale and downscale. If we talk about, the potential loading of building design suites, we've probably got 45 gig of data there that you've got to load onto a workstation. For IT, that's quite a process. So the deployment of new users in a virtualized environment is quite simply a new user is set up and provided access centrally by IT, and then those applications which already reside on the server are made available to that user. So it's a very simple process. Deploying 10 new users is going to take an IT manager somewhere in the region of 10 to 15 minutes, as opposed to the probably half a day doing the install on each workstation to deploy that in that distributed environment. So that's the enterprise mobility, as well as of course, providing the mobility for the users who can now access from anywhere on any device. So let's look at the cost savings that we're talking about with a virtualized deployment, because this is what it's all about. The hardware cost, as we mentioned, endpoint devices, we take away the need for great expenditure at endpoint devices, bringing it all central into the server. Servers are effectively running more efficiently. They're more designed for this heavy-duty processing. We can get better, faster processors. So we've got a central resource, investment made in the server. Centrally, the resource sits there on demand for the users as and when they need it. But the key thing here, we're taking away that need for investment at the endpoint devices. The existing workstations can be used until they stop working, replaced with a really low-cost thin client as they go forward. Or indeed, as we've said, this fits into the any device. So I wouldn't like a designer to be working on an iPad for 8 hours. But if you're able to access your data and applications on an iPad, for someone who's occasionally doing site work and needs to pull up a file and see the current and up-to-date information, it's a massive ability, even making minor amendments to that. And even accessing over 3G, this is possible with these devices. So any device we're fitting into branch, site, home working, hot desking, and obviously the facility for anyone to come in, any device is key. Now, we move on from there, where we're talking about cost savings. Next on the list, network. Well, we've got a reduction in the stress on the network. We're reducing the bandwidth, keystrokes, pixel changes, mouse movements going across the network. That's really it. What does this mean? Where does this save costs? Well, we can potentially look at lease lines, reduction in lease lines, in pipe sizes, reduction in network requirement, perhaps not needing to do the upgrade to an MPLS, perhaps being able to have users accessing over ADSL. So we can reduce a lot of the stuff that goes on over the network. File sharing programs, as I say, WAN optimization tools can all be reduced. So there can be some significant reductions in terms of what we're needing and what commitments needing to be made at the network. With security, this is not so much about direct costs as indeed more of a management issue. It's really about the increased cost for IT in trying to secure data when it leaves the control of the corporate environment and moves out to a third party. So it's all about the control measures, data management tools employed in frankly what is pretty much a fruitless task in trying to control stuff that falls outside of the remit of IT. And that's always one of the biggest issues about where we look at for cost saving. So for virtualization, the cost saving is simple. All of these issues have gone because the data never leaves the secure environment of the servers or data center. So there's no issue of security coming to light because we've basically maintained the data in that secure environment. So all of these IT headaches are taken away. So this is one of the big things. And the key to all of this, to be quite honest, is about IT management. This is when it really comes into its own, is how much we're looking at IT management, the big savings. Well, if we look at this stage by stage, the management of the hardware, well, we've now got central servers. We've got no more distributed workstations to be managed at a hardware level. So cost of workstation management, we all, there's loads of figures bandied around about this, varying figures about how much it costs to manage a workstation, a single workstation. But what we're talking about here, even if it's just down to the reduction in the number of devices, IT now manages a far smaller number of devices, basically single servers or multiple servers. The endpoint devices, of course, they can relinquish that management. These are the end users' devices. It's fitting into the bring your own device policies, etc., etc. So we've seen a huge reduction in hardware management there. In application management, this is the next big point. All of the applications held centrally at the servers, and from there we can manage those applications as a single instance. We're talking there with patches, upgrades, any fixes. They can all be done centrally, done as a single instance management, and then delivered to those users in their distributed environment. So no longer do we have all of this workstation deployments that need access on many different areas, locations, even different companies, different geos. It's all now down to single instance management covered by IT. So we also, of course, got the management of the data, centrally controlled, removes any of that cost of trying to secure it, trying to control it. The other key thing, users. How does IT control all of those users? Well, now this is all done, of course, centrally. User access is controlled centrally. What applications, what versions, what data, when they have control. As those users change during the project life cycle, that can all be controlled at the flick of a button by IT from a central location as opposed to this distributed environment. So the other big management saving, let's talk, and I touched upon this, cost of deployment. If we're looking at deploying new users to meet, or project users to meet a new project requirement, the amount of data you've got to load just to meet building design suite, as I said, we've got 40 gig plus of data to load onto a workstation for deployment. So the cost of new user deployment for upscaling and even downscaling. If we're talking about project requirements, servers can be redeployed for a new project or re-provisioned for a new project, as opposed to workstation reprovisioning. Huge savings in terms of management and time that's spent. So I think we can see we've seen development in CAD products, the adoption of BIM, increased requirements on hardware, and this has all put an increased demand. This workstation deployment has all put an increase in demand and cost for IT through products such as data management, security, network controls, and indirectly increased costs of IT management. And additionally, meeting the needs for collaboration actually undermines the business by failing to provide the necessary levels of security and IP protection that that the business actually needs. So virtualization solutions will ultimately providing enterprise mobility, allowing a business to respond to its changes, its needs, the demands, scaling up and down as the project's demands, making it more responsive and able to meet the needs of collaboration, and underpinning that with the levels of security and equally control that IT and both the business demand. So virtualization or cloud solutions provide the perfect platform. By their very nature, they're ideal to effectively provide the processing power needed for the large files and models, benefit from the built-in security, centralized data, while providing secured and controlled access for any user on any device from anywhere. So they're perfectly meeting the needs for collaboration, removing the problem of security compromise from distributed data traditionally associated in the workstation deployment. And most importantly, at the same time, they provide significant financial savings, reducing the total cost of ownership, and of course increasing the return on investment. But most importantly, and I think this is the thing to re-emphasize, is the huge savings we're seeing in the cost of IT management. So the final point I want to make to you is a simple one. This really is just to explain and reinforce the fact that this is not a workaround solution. It's not a compromise solution. We can provide workstation performance even over the WAN. So we have a couple of demo servers set up. We've got them here in EMEA, actually in UK and London. Got one in the US as well. Those demo servers are there available for people to come and try. We can let you upload your own data for a trial period. I would push everybody to have a look at the website. All of the details are there. You can access or put in requests for access to the demo servers from there. Come and have a look, try this out. You will see the level of performance we can achieve. That is an open internet solution. You're not coming in on any controlled lines, so this is just coming in on the open internet out of our control without any WAN optimization. I still think you'll be very impressed with the level of performance we can achieve. We do expect to up that by 30 to 50% when we're talking about deploying this in a secure corporate network. So I think it will give you a good idea what performance we can achieve. The savings are obvious and evident to everybody now, I hope, and I hope I've highlighted those for you today. Do have a look, lots of information on the website. My details are on the screen if you want to get in touch. I've seen no questions come in so far on the webinar. If anybody has any questions, I'm open to take those now, if you just pop those in the box. So I'm going to give this a couple of minutes to see if we've got anything coming in, but there's nothing at the moment. So what I am going to say at this stage, thank you very much for your time and for listening. I hope you've enjoyed today's webinar, and that's given you a bit of an insight as to where you can save money in IT expenditure looking at virtualized deployment. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening today. Do have a good day.